London, May 19, 1536. The air is thick with the kind of silence that only death can inspire. A pale sun struggles to rise over the Tower of London. Inside its grey stone walls, something grim is being prepared. Not a battle, not a siege, but the death of a queen. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, is hours away from losing her head. At just 35, she's lived a life of intensity, scandal, and political upheaval. Now, standing on the edge of history, she awakens in her prison chamber for the final time. The walls that once echoed with whispers of state secrets are now silent, holding only her prayers. Her ladies, in waiting, loyal to the last breath, help her dress. Each movement is slow, deliberate. She wears a crimson bodice and a dark grey cloak lined with fur colours, chosen with purpose. Crimson for power, for blood, and for rebellion. Outside, whispers have already begun to spread through the cobbled streets. The Queen is to be executed, they say. The words travel from mouth to mouth like a chilling breeze. In a society where loyalty to the monarch is divine law, the notion of a queen condemned to die strikes at the heart of everything sacred. But Anne is no ordinary queen. She was never meant to wear the crown. Her rise was meteoric, her power immense, her fall catastrophic. And it's that fall that brings us here to this scaffold, this crowd, this sword. Anne Boleyn's execution is not just a personal tragedy. It's a national spectacle, a scandal that has shaken the monarchy to its core. How did it come to this? How did the woman who redefined England's relationship with the church, who mesmerized Henry VIII into breaking from Rome, become a traitor in her own kingdom? The answer lies in a labyrinth of ambition, betrayal, miscarried promises, and cold, calculated power plays. But before we unravel the years that led to this chilling moment, let's stay here in the haunting stillness of her final morning. It's just past 8 a.m. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupts the prayer. A messenger, eyes cast downward, enters. The execution has been delayed until noon. No explanation, no apology, just a cruel twist of timing. For Anne, who had steeled her nerves, who had already reconciled with her God, it is a brutal mental blow. But she doesn't flinch. She nods in silence, her face unreadable. This isn't just courage, it's defiance wrapped in grace. She returns to prayer. Her voice is soft but steady. Lord, have mercy on me. Christ, have mercy on me. These ancient words, repeated again and again, are no longer ritual. Their armor, the scaffold, constructed overnight, stands quietly in the courtyard. Unlike most English executions, which use an axe, Anne's will be performed by a French swordsman, brought in especially for her. It's meant to be cleaner, swifter, more merciful. But that mercy has its own irony. Henry, the man who condemned her, now ensures the blade that kills her is sharp and foreign. A calculated decision, perhaps to appease the international court. Or maybe, just maybe, a last remnant of his affection. What must it feel like to know your executioner crossed the channel just for you? Anne has no visitors from court, no final pardon, no final gesture of affection from Henry. All that remains is ritual, her last communion, a whispered prayer, the soft rustle of her gown, the occasional stifled sob from one of her women. Does she think of her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old? Of the promises Henry made in those early days of passion and obsession? Or of her enemies, Cromwell, the Seymours, and every courtier who smiled while sharpening their daggers? We can't know her final thoughts, but we know her actions. She gives gifts to her ladies awaiting small tokens of remembrance. A prayer, book, a handkerchief, a necklace. Remember me and how I end, she says. It is a request and a challenge all at once. In those words, Anne is not asking for pity. She is demanding legacy. By 11:30, the courtyard has begun to fill. No roaring crowds today, no shouting mobs. Instead, there's an eerie quiet. About 1,000 people have come, nobles, soldiers, commoners. Some out of duty, others out of dread. They remove their hats when she appears, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to awe. Anne steps onto the lawn with poise, the same poise that seduced a king, divided a church, and changed the course of England's destiny. Her face is pale, but her steps are sure. She walks not as a prisoner, but as a queen. On the scaffold, she is given a chance to speak. She does not cry, she does not rage. Instead, she praises the king. "Good Christian people," she begins, "I am come hither to die according to the law." She speaks not to accuse, but to preserve what little dignity remains. She blesses Henry, calls him a gentle and sovereign lord. It's a calculated mercy, a final act of political intelligence, to go down without tarnishing the crown, to protect her daughter's future, even as she herself is erased. And soon, very soon, it will be over, but not forgotten. But beneath her calm, beneath the carefully chosen words and practiced gestures, there must be something else. A storm of memories dot her first days at court, when she was simply the clever daughter of Thomas Boleyn. Her time in France, where she absorbed the elegance and intellectual depth that later stunned the English court. The moment Henry's gaze first lingered on her, not with mere desire, but with obsession. And how could she not think of Mary, her sister, who had once been the king's mistress, of her father's ambitions, of the impossible gamble she made when she said no to a king, unless he made her queen. Anne had played the game of power, and for a time she had won. She was crowned. She bore the Tudor heir, or so they hoped. But that child, Elizabeth, had not been the son England demanded. And in the cutthroat theatre of royal politics, there are no second chances for queens who fail to produce heirs. As the hour draws closer, the atmosphere thickens. Even the birds seem quieter, as if nature itself is holding its breath. The swordsman waits, hands steady, expression unreadable. He has done this before, but never to a queen, and kneels. There is no block, only the grass, the air, the eyes of 1,000 silent witnesses. One of her ladies ties a blindfold over her eyes. Another helps arrange her cloak, and still Anne prays, "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The executioner steps back. Then, in perfect French calm, he says aloud, "Where is my sword?" A distraction, a kindness. As Anne turns her head slightly, the blade, already in hand, flashes through the air. It will all be over in seconds. But her legacy, that will last centuries. Anne Boleyn, the queen who refused to be merely a mistress, the woman who changed. A kingdom is about to make history, not in life, but in death. Before the tower, before the scaffold, before she was a queen or a condemned woman, and Boleyn was simply a girl born into ambition. The year was likely 1501, though even that detail is debated. Anne's origins are wrapped in as much mystery as her legacy. What is certain is that she was born into the Boleyn family, a rising, ambitious house rooted in both mercantile wealth and noble blood. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat with a relentless eye for opportunity. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, belonged to one of England's most prestigious families. Anne was not a commoner, but neither was she royal. She stood on the fragile edge between power and vulnerability. From the start, Anne was different. She wasn't the classic beauty of the Tudor age. Pale skin and golden curls were the currency of desirability, and had olive-toned skin, thick dark hair, and piercing black eyes that seemed to look straight through you. She was called the Black-Eyed Witch by her enemies, and bewitching by those who fell under her spell. But it wasn't her looks that made it unforgettable. It was her mind. At a young age, Anne was sent to the Netherlands and then to the glittering court of France. This decision was no accident. Tit was part of her father's plan to polish his daughters into court-worthy women. In France, Anne absorbed everything: language, music, dance, fashion, court etiquette, politics, and the rising tide of Renaissance humanism. She moved in circles where women conversed with poets, debated with theologians, and influenced kings. These years shaped Anne into something rare, a woman who could not only survive in court but thrive. When Anne returned to England in the early 1520s, she was unlike any woman at court. Worldly, articulate, confident, and unapologetically ambitious. But her entrance was quiet. She served first in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the very woman she would one day replace. No one knew it then, but the seeds of history were already planted. Henry VIII had been married to Catherine for nearly 2 decades. Their union, once passionate, had grown cold. Worse, it had failed in the one thing that mattered most: producing a male heir. Catherine's only surviving child was a daughter. Mary, the king, was anxious, desperate, and increasingly aware of his own mortality. Enter Anne, but Anne did not step into the king's path willingly, or so the legend goes. Henry's eye first fell on her around 1525. She was witty, musical, and dazzling in conversation. Everything a courtier craved, but Anne had already learned from her sister Mary's mistakes. Mary Boleyn had been the king's mistress, used and discarded, her name barely whispered in public afterward. Anne refused to be a footnote. "If you want my body," she's rumoured to have told the king, "you must give me a crown." It was the boldest ultimatum in Tudor history, and Henry, astonishingly, agreed. The pursuit began. For 7 years, Henry courted Anne with an intensity bordering on obsession. He wrote her passionate letters, he showered her with gifts, and behind the scenes, he prepared to upend the entire religious and political structure of England. Just to have her Anne, too, was not passive in this courtship. She understood what it meant. If she succeeded, she'd be queen. If she failed, she'd be cast as a seductress who brought ruin upon a nation. But ambition burned bright in Anne Boleyn, and she played the game with unmatched finesse. She surrounded herself with reformers and intellectuals. She encouraged Henry to read banned texts, English translations of the Bible, works by Protestant thinkers, critiques of papal corruption. She wasn't just the woman beside the king. She was shaping the king's mind. By 1533, after years of political maneuvering and religious defiance, Henry broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively birthing the English Reformation, all for Anne. In January of that year, they married in secret. She was already pregnant. It was a triumph. Anne, the daughter of a diplomat, was now Queen of England. Anne's coronation on June 1st, 1533, was unlike any before it. Pregnant with what the court believed would be a male heir, She entered Westminster Abbey to trumpet fanfare, a golden canopy held above her head. For a moment, the kingdom held its breath. The promise of a new Tudor age seemed within reach. But when her child was born that September, it was not a boy, but a girl, a red-haired infant named Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but not yet disillusioned. Anne, after all, was young. There would be more children, more chances, but fate had a different plan. Still, for a brief moment, Anne wielded tremendous influence. As queen, she pushed forward her own network of allies, her family, reformist, clergymen, scholars, and Protestant thinkers. She patronized artists and funded translations of the Bible into English, bringing scripture into the hands of commoners. Anne believed in the power of words, and she believed that truth should not be a luxury reserved for Latin speakers or the clergy. But even as she rose, the knives were being sharpened. Anne was no passive consort. She had opinions. She challenged Henry. She intervened in matters of policy and religion. For some, this was thrilling. For others, dangerous. Many of the old guard at court, those loyal to Catherine of Aragon and the traditional Catholic structure, viewed Anne as an interloper, a foreign influence, even a witch. And then came the miscarriages. In 1534, Anne lost a second child. The whispers began that she was cursed, that God disapproved of the union, that she had led the king into sin and dragged the country down with her. She became pregnant again. In 1535, this time, the stakes were even higher. If it were a boy, her position would be cemented forever. But in January 1536, disaster struck. She miscarried again, and this time the fetus was male. The timing couldn't have been worse. That very same month, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne, now the sole queen in title and reality, should have felt secure. Instead, she felt more vulnerable than ever. Catherine's death removed the last obstacle to Henry remarrying, and the king's affections had already begun to shift. Jane Seymour, meek, obedient, and untouched, had caught his eye. Anne was aware and terrified. She fought to keep Henry's attention. She used charm, wit, even anger, but it was slipping. The man who once changed the world to marry her now avoided her gaze. Anne's position at court became precarious. Her enemies multiplied, chief among them Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless chief minister. Once her ally, he now saw her as an obstacle to his consolidation of power. Cromwell was a master of political theatre. He orchestrated a campaign to destroy Anne, collecting rumors, inventing accusations, pressuring witnesses. What he lacked in evidence, he made up for in intimidation. His goal wasn't just Anne's fall, it was her total annihilation. And Henry, he didn't stop him. In April 1536, Anne's world began to unravel. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. Treason, conspiracy to kill the king. All lies, concocted and forced into the mouths of terrified courtiers. Anne was arrested on May 2nd and taken to the Tower of London, the very place where she had once celebrated her coronation. This time, there were no cheers, only chains. On May 15th, she was put on trial in the King's Hall. The jury was stacked against her. She had no legal counsel, no access to the evidence, no defense but her own voice. And yet, she dazzled. Witnesses later recounted how she spoke with poise, intelligence, and devastating honesty. She answered so wisely and discreetly, one said that it was a marvel, but it didn't matter. The verdict was already decided. She was guilty. The sentence, to be burned alive or beheaded. Henry commuted the sentence to beheading, not out of mercy, but efficiency. Anne was scheduled to die on May 18th. But even this small mercy was twisted. Her execution was postponed by a day, leaving her suspended between life and death for one more night. And so we return to where we began. A queen, alone, on the edge of history. Anne Boleyn was not born to rule, but she ruled nonetheless. With intellect, charisma, and conviction, she changed England not by sword or battle, but by sheer force of presence, and she paid the price. This is the making of a queen, not in her crown, not in her marriage, but in her fire. Even the structure of her downfall reveals the fear she inspired. It wasn't enough to remove an Anne from power. Her enemies wanted her memory obliterated. Her emblems were torn down, her initials scraped from palace walls, her name struck from records. The very existence of Anne Boleyn was treated like a contagion. And yet she endured. Whispers of her continued long after the blade fell, in corridors of power, in the minds of those she touched, in the ink of forbidden books, and in the resolve of her daughter, who wore Anne's white falcon emblem with pride. That is the paradox of Anne Boleyn. She was feared for her ambition, punished for her influence, and silenced for her intellect. But in silencing her, they made her eternal. Her life is a mirror held up to the power structures of her time, a challenge to the notion that obedience is virtue and silence is safety. Anne chose neither. She chose to live out loud even when it meant dying in public. Her rise wasn't luck. Her downfall wasn't just fate. It was a confrontation with a system that wasn't ready for a woman like her. Anne Boleyn wasn't simply made queen. She forced history to crown her. Henry VIII was not a man accustomed to denial. He was a king raised to believe his desires were divine codes of God's will. And yet, for the first time in his life, a woman said no. Anne Boleyn was not the first to catch the king's eye. The English court, with its games of flirtation and elegance, was fertile ground for attraction. Henry had mistresses, he had power, he had charm. But when he turned his gaze upon Anne, something shifted. She didn't play the game the way others had. She didn't bat her lashes and yield to his power. She set the rules. "If you want my heart and my body," she said, "you must make me your wife." It was an audacious line in any era, but from a woman of Anne's standing, it was revolutionary, and Henry was spellbound. What began as desire soon evolved into obsession. She became a puzzle he had to solve, a prize he had to win, and ultimately a queen he had to crown. For Anne, this wasn't just romantic ambition, it was strategic. She had witnessed her sister Mary become the king's discarded mistress, her reputation damaged beyond repair. Anne wouldn't let history repeat itself. She wouldn't settle for temporary affection. She would command permanence or nothing at all. Henry pursued her with the full weight of royal obsession, lavish gifts, poetic letters, promises of loyalty. These letters, nearly 30 of which survive, reveal a man unraveling under the spell of love and lust. He called her my mistress and my friend, my heart's desire. He mourned. Each day they were apart, but what he wanted, what he needed, was not just Anne, but a son. And Anne, too, saw the stakes. If she could give Henry a male heir, she would be untouchable. But first, there was one obstacle: Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had been married to Henry for nearly 20 years. Though once loved, she was now blamed for every disappointment, every failure to produce a son. Anne's presence only heightened the tension. To marry Anne, Henry needed something no English king had ever secured her: divorce sanctioned by the Pope. In 1527, Henry petitioned Rome. He argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, citing a biblical verse against marrying a brother's widow. It was a thin legal argument masking a deeper truth. He needed Anne, and Catherine stood in the way. But the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused. What followed was a legal and theological war that spanned 7 years and shook the foundations of Europe. Clerics debated, ambassadors threatened. Henry grew impatient. Anne, meanwhile, remained at court but never alone with the king. She built a reputation as the king's lady, always near, never compromised. This restraint only fueled Henry's passion. Eventually, the impasse reached its breaking point. In 1533, defying the Pope's authority, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He annulled his own marriage and wed Anne in secret. By June, she was publicly crowned queen. This was not a love affair. This was a transformation of a nation engineered by obsession, consummated by defiance. But what Henry didn't anticipate was that the very fire that drew him to Anne would one day consume their marriage. Anne's coronation marked the pinnacle of their union. The streets of London were filled with banners, music, and murmurs. Some cheered, others muttered that England had crowned its concubine, but none could deny that Anne Boleyn had transformed from courtier to queen, and that the king had rewritten the laws of England to place a crown on her head. Yet, within the walls of court, their marriage began to fray almost immediately. The long years of pursuit had built Anne into a figure of fantasy, mysterious, unattainable, idealized. But fantasy cannot live in daylight. Anne was now queen, no longer a mystery but a reality, one who had opinions, a voice, and expectations of her husband. She was fiercely intelligent, politically savvy, and not afraid to challenge Henry. At first, this was intoxicating. Anne's mind excited him as much as her presence. She spoke boldly, backed reformers, argued for the education of women, and elevated scholars and clergy aligned with her ideals. But gradually, her assertiveness began to grate. Henry, accustomed to deference, found Anne's sharp tongue harder to bear. Still, she held power so long as she could deliver a son. Anne's first pregnancy ended with the birth of Elizabeth. It was a blow, not a disaster, but not the triumph Henry had staked everything on. He needed a male heir to secure the Tudor line, his entire legitimacy, his defiance of Rome. His break with Catherine rested on that one promise that Anne would give him a son. Anne knew it, and the pressure was unbearable. Their private life grew strained. The man who had once written her love poems now retreated in cold silence. Anne, feeling isolated, became more anxious, more prone to outbursts. She tried to reignite his interest. She worked to remain visible. But by 1534, the cracks were wide enough for others to slip through, most notably Jane Seymour. Jane was everything Anne wasn't: gentle, submissive, quiet. Where Anne sparred, Jane yielded. Where an inspired passion, Jane offered peace. Henry, weary of turbulence, found himself drawn to this pale, reserved figure, and the obsession that had once lifted Anne began to turn on her. Henry's affection cooled, his presence waned, and Anne's pregnancies ended in tragedy. Miscarriages in 1534 and 1535, a final loss in January 1536, a male fetus. It was the end of hope. Henry's disappointment morphed into resentment. Anne, once the solution to all his problems, now seemed their source. Courtiers noticed. Enemies circled. The woman who had been untouchable was now vulnerable. And Henry, he began to believe she had bewitched him, that she had tricked him with sorcery, that his love had been unnatural. These were not rational conclusions, they were the justifications of a man seeking escape. A man who had remade his kingdom for love, and now needed to undo it without undoing himself. Obsession had curdled into danger. Henry's desire once moved mountains. Now it demanded blood. In the spring of 1536, Henry began to pull away entirely. His mood darkened. He was cold, calculating, and distant. And noticed, of course. She tried to hold on. She attended every court event. She flirted, smiled, prayed. But behind her back, alliances were shifting. The man who once defied the Pope for her was now discussing annulment. Enter Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, now her adversary. Cromwell had grown tired of her interference in court politics. Her reformist zeal threatened his more pragmatic ambitions, and, crucially, he sensed that Henry's heart had turned. It was Cromwell who crafted the final strategy: destroy Anne not only as queen, but as a woman through scandal, shame, and public disgrace. The charges were wild. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Treason, conspiring against the king's life. There was no proof, only forced confessions, manipulated testimonies, and whispers turned into weaponized accusations. And Henry believed it, or chose to. After years of chasing Anne, years of risking everything, he now stood back and watched her be accused, arrested, and condemned. He did not intervene, he did not visit, he did not question. The obsession was dead. On May 2nd, Anne was taken to the Tower. On May 15th, she was put on trial before a jury of her enemies. She defended herself with grace and eloquence, but the verdict was sealed before she spoke. She was sentenced to death. To the public, Henry maintained a face of sorrow and royal duty, but privately, he was already preparing for his next wedding. He wore white to celebrate Anne's execution. He dined in joy the day she died. This was not heartbreak. It was liberation. And yet, even in this betrayal, Henry's obsession cast a long shadow. He ordered that Anne be executed by sword knot, axe bringing in a French specialist. He wanted it to be quick, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of memory, perhaps because a part of him still admired the woman who had once set his soul on fire. But admiration could not compete with fear. Fear of political instability, fear of failure, fear of being wrong. Henry had convinced himself that Anne was everything he desired. When she proved to be human, complex, and powerful, he decided she had betrayed him. It's a story as old as monarchy and as modern as any broken relationship. The obsession that rewrote England's religious map, that destroyed a queen and gave birth to another, was never just about love. It was about control, about legacy, about a man terrified of his own mortality and desperate to be remembered. Anne Boleyn gave him that legacy not in the son he longed for, but in the daughter who would become one of the greatest monarchs in history. In the end, Henry's obsession didn't destroy Anne, it made her immortal. She was not a victim of love, she was the consequence of it, the shadow behind the crown, the ghost that would follow Henry for the rest of his reign. Because no matter how many portraits he burned, no matter how many tombs he built, Henry could never erase what Anne had meant or what he had done to her. His obsession changed the world, but it also destroyed him. In the years that followed Anne's death, Henry's obsession never truly vanished, simply mutated. Her memory became a ghost at court. Her name was scrubbed from records. Her initials, once entwined with Henry's in carved wood and stone, were chiseled away with cold efficiency. But the scars were deeper than masonry. Henry never spoke of her again in public. He refused to allow her burial to be marked. He married Jane Seymour just days after Anne's execution, as if to overwrite the past with a more compliant narrative. But privately, those who knew him claimed that the fire never left him. He would never again pursue a woman with such fever, never again defy the world for love. Anne was the last time Henry risked everything. Some historians argue that her ghost haunted him, that every failure afterward, every disappointment, every stillborn heir, every rebellion echoed with her name. Others believe he buried it all, that his obsession turned to bitterness and shame. Perhaps both are true. What is undeniable is this: Anne changed Henry. Before her, he was a king with romantic ambitions. After her, he was a man who executed wives. The king who once broke with the Catholic Church out of passion and desire ended his reign in tyranny and paranoia. The court grew darker. His health declined. His temper shortened. And through it all, the daughter of the woman he once loved, Elizabeth, was watching. Anne's greatest revenge was survival through legacy. Elizabeth I would ascend the throne in 1558, 22 years after her mother's death. She never married, declaring herself wed to England. She wore Anne's falcon crest. She surrounded herself with scholars, reformers, and powerful women. She ruled for 45 years and left behind an empire that reshaped the world. And Henry, he became a symbol of excess, of power unrestrained, of a man so afraid of failure that he destroyed the one person who reflected his own ambition back at him. Anne Boleyn was the mirror, the muse, the mistake, the obsession, and in the end, the woman who was too bold to be queen became too powerful to be forgotten. She haunted his heart and changed history forever. June 1st, 1533, Westminster Abbey was transformed. Banners rippled from the spires. Crowds filled the streets. Golden tapestries and fresh flowers lined the procession route as trumpets echoed across London. It was a coronation unlike any the realm had seen, not because it crowned a queen. England had crowned queens before, but because this queen had not come from royal blood. She had risen by force of will. Anne Boleyn entered Westminster under a canopy of gold cloth, carried by 6 knights. She wore crimson and ermine, and her dark hair cascaded loose beneath a crown custom-made for her. The English looked on with a mix of awe and disbelief. Some bowed, others whispered. There was reverence, but also tension. For many, this coronation was a triumph. For others, a national scandal. Anne had changed everything. She wasn't simply a new wife. She was the reason England had broken from the Pope, torn from Catholicism, and plunged into religious upheaval. Her coronation symbolized not just a marriage, but a revolution. Yet Anne moved through it all with majesty. She bowed to no one. She rode alone, without the king. She stood as the central figure, not consort, but sovereign in her own right. But even as Anne was being crowned, forces were aligning against her. Her pregnancy had been declared a divine sign, a promise that she was chosen to give England its longed-for male heir. And that promise hung in the air like incense sweet, powerful and suffocating. Inside the abbey, Anne was anointed with holy oil. The archbishop placed the crown on her head as choirs filled the space with song. It was a sacred ritual, but behind the hymns there were doubts. Many nobles refused to attend. Foreign ambassadors watched in silence. The Pope had declared the marriage invalid. Catherine of Aragon, though banished, still had her supporters, and Henry's decision to crown Anne as queen without papal blessing created a chasm in the European order. But none of that mattered. In that moment, Anne stood, radiant and fierce. She had she had outmaneuvered queens, clergy, and kings. She had outlasted the Vatican, and now she held power. Anne's early reign was marked by intensity and purpose. She was not a decorative queen, she was involved, vocal, and visionary. She took an active role in governance, sitting in on council meetings, promoting religious reformers, and pushing for the expansion of English-language Bibles. Her household became a hub of intellectual life. She surrounded herself with scholars, poets, and theologians, many of them Protestant sympathizers. She supported William Tyndale's writings, once banned, and funded the translation of the Bible so that ordinary people might read it. To the conservative elite, this was dangerous radicalism. To Anne, it was a sacred mission. She had a particular gift for patronage. She distributed church appointments to her allies. She protected reformist bishops like Thomas Cranmer. Her influence extended even to foreign policy, where she advocated for alliances with Protestant German states. But her power was not unchallenged. Though she was queen, she was never fully accepted by the old nobility. Many saw her as an upstart, a manipulator, worse still, a heretic. The shadow of Catherine of Aragon loomed large. Catherine was still beloved by many in England, and Anne's rise so swift, so unconventional made enemies at every step. Still, Anne carried herself with majesty. At court, she projected confidence and elegance. Her fashion was bold, her manners sharp. She demanded loyalty and precision from her ladies. She controlled her image with care of her gesture, every glance crafted to maintain power. And yet, there were cracks. After Elizabeth's birth in September 1533, expectations were high. Henry believed a son would come soon. Anne became pregnant, again in 1534, but miscarried. The disappointment was deep, but not devastating. She was still young. There was still time, but the whispers had begun that she was too proud, that she had overstepped, that she had bewitched the king. Enemies circled quietly Thomas, Cromwell chief among them, once her ally, now increasingly at odds with her religious interference and political assertiveness. Anne could feel it. She tried to reinforce her position through diplomacy, through family connections, through more pregnancies. But behind the silks and ceremonies, tension was rising. The same boldness that won her the crown was beginning to feel like a threat to those around her. One of Anne's most controversial acts of power was her role in the fall of Thomas More. More, a brilliant scholar and former Lord Chancellor, refused to acknowledge the validity of Anne's marriage. He would not take the oath of supremacy, which declared Henry the head of the Church of England, a role Anne had helped shape. Though not her personal enemy, his refusal was a direct challenge to the new order Anne represented. Anne reportedly urged Henry to act decisively. More was imprisoned, then executed in 1535. Some, it was a necessary political move. To others, it confirmed their worst fears that Anne was ruthless, even bloodthirsty. Whether that was true or not, one fact was inescapable. Anne had real power, power to shape policy, power to influence executions, power to define the new England that was emerging from the ashes of the old. But with power came isolation. Anne had few trusted friends at court. Her temperament was quick, her standards high. She could be generous, but also cutting. She expected loyalty and was swift to punish betrayal. Over time, even some of her allies grew cautious. And Henry, he was beginning to change. By 1535, his gaze was already drifting. Anne had not yet delivered a son. The court was growing restless. The novelty of their union had worn off. Henry, once driven by passion, was turning pragmatic again. The king who had broken with Rome for love was now calculating lineage, legacy, and public opinion. Anne tried to hold his attention. She played music, she danced, she debated. But Jane Seymour, quiet and submissive, had already begun to rise in favor. Anne noticed Dot and worried. Her pregnancy in 1535 brought renewed hope. This child, she believed, would change everything. But in January 1536, after Catherine of Aragon's death, Anne suffered a miscarriage male fetus. The symbolism was cruel. Her greatest rival was dead. Her most important chance had slipped away. Something shifted in Henry. Those closest to him began to suggest Anne had deceived him, that her sharpness, her pride, her very power had led England into danger. The woman he had once defended at all costs was now increasingly alone. And yet, Anne still acted like a queen. She continued to engage with foreign ambassadors, protect reformist bishops, and promote the English Bible. She walked court corridors with the same pride she had when she wore the crown. But fewer curtsies followed her. More doors stayed closed. She had reached the peak end now. The descent had begun. Her enemies, once quiet, were now emboldened. Cromwell began building a case against her. Whispers turned into records. Loyalty turned into silence. Still, Anne resisted. She had faced every challenge with steel. She believed she could survive this too, that her brilliance, her faith, and her daughter would protect her. But history had already taken its turn. Anne Boleyn's coronation had been a triumph of will. Her reign, a portrait of complexity, visionary, turbulent, defiant. She changed England not by inheritance, but by insistence. She forced her way into power and dared to wield it, and for that she became the most dangerous woman in the kingdom. The crown she wore was heavy, and soon it would be taken. The final months of Anne's reign were marked by quiet desperation. Outwardly, she maintained composure. She attended court functions with her usual grace. She smiled when necessary, engaged when expected, but beneath the surface, she was fighting to hold everything together. The allies she had elevated were now cautious in her presence. The scholars and clerics she once championed spoke less boldly. Even her family, so integral to her essence, felt the shifting winds. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, began to distance himself. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a staunch Catholic, had always walked a careful line. Anne could feel the structure she built cracking under her feet, and Henry, he no longer needed her. He had the power he once lacked. The break from Rome was complete. The Church of England was his to command. And with Catherine of Aragon gone, his conscience was quieter. He could now start again without Anne. What's most tragic is that Anne knew she was one of the most politically astute figures of her time. She read faces, rumors, and silences like scripture. She sensed the betrayal before it arrived. But by then, her power so daringly won was slipping through her fingers. Yet she did not retreat. Anne continued to fight. She defended her name, reaffirmed her loyalty, and reminded the court of her sacrifice. She clung to Elizabeth, her last legacy, and doubled down on her image as a rightful queen. But power, once granted, can vanish overnight, and soon it did. Anne Boleyn's coronation had signaled a new era. Her reign tested the limits of monarchy, marriage, and religion. She had climbed to the highest throne not on bloodlines, but brilliance, and for a brief, shining moment, she ruled with fire. But in the world she had reshaped, fire was as dangerous as it was divine. Anne burned too brightly, and the crown she had seized would become the weapon used to silence her. In early 1536, Anne Boleyn was still Queen of England, but she was walking on a knife's edge. Her miscarriage in January of a male child was a devastating blow. It came just days after the death of Catherine of Aragon, her rival. The symbolism could not be ignored. As one queen died, the other failed to produce the son who would cement her own reign. Henry VIII was furious. Silent, withdrawn, he had staked everything: his marriage, his church, his crown, and Anne. And now, 5 years into their union, she had given him only a daughter and heartbreak. He did not scream or storm. Instead, he grew cold, and coldness in a Tudor court was fatal. Anne sensed the shift. She redoubled her efforts to win him back. She tried charm, wit, prayer, but something had changed. Henry's affection had curdled. His attention had turned elsewhere toward Jane Seymour, a quiet lady-in-waiting who had learned from Anne how to wait and how to win. By spring, Anne's place at court began to fracture. The smiles were fewer, the invitations rarer, and behind the scenes, enemies were closing in. Chief among them, Thomas Cromwell. Once her political ally, Cromwell had grown wary of Anne's influence. Her support for religious reform was beginning to clash with his more pragmatic strategies. Anne wanted to transform England's soul. Cromwell wanted to control its machinery. They clashed over money, over policy, over who should rise in court. And eventually, they clashed over survival. Cromwell knew that as long as Anne stood beside the king, his own power was at risk. And now that Henry's love had faded, Cromwell saw his chance. He would not merely unseat Anne, he would destroy her. Cromwell began to collect whispers. The Tudor court was a place of secrets and ears every hallway. Every chamber carried echoes of intrigue. Cromwell used it all. He summoned frightened courtiers, pressed servants, twisted drunken comments into confessions. He did not need evidence, he needed a story. And the story he crafted was devastating. Anne, he claimed, had committed adultery with not 1, but 5 men. Among them, courtiers, musicians, even her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were wild, scandalous, and transparently false. But Cromwell knew the court. He knew that with the king's silence, the lie would not be challenged, and with the king's approval, it would become truth. In late April, the arrests began. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was taken first. He was lowborn, vulnerable, under torture or the threat of it. He confessed to being Anne's lover. Next came Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's oldest friends, then William Brereton, then Francis Weston, and finally George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The charges were absurd. They claimed Anne had seduced men in public spaces on specific days when she was either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or in Henry's own presence, but no one questioned the timeline. The court had made up its mind. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested. She was dining with friends when the king's orders came. Shocked, she was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same river she had sailed triumphantly just 3 years earlier for her coronation. Now she was a prisoner, and asked over and over, "What am I accused of?" But there were no clear answers, only silence, and silence was the sound of betrayal. The Tower was not new to Anne. She had known it as a place of glory, the site of her coronation banquet, where cheers once echoed and noblemen bowed. But now it was her cell. Her world had shrunk to stone walls, a narrow bed, and the constant presence of guards. She prayed, she wept, she demanded answers, but no answer came. Her ladies-in-waiting were chosen not for loyalty, but for surveillance. Every word and uttered was reported back to Cromwell. Every prayer, every sob, every question. She was surrounded not by comfort, but by spies. And through it all, she held on to hope. Anne believed that Henry would come to his senses, that he would see the lies for what they were, that he would remember the years they shared, the daughter they had created, the kingdom she had helped reshape. But Henry sent no message, not a word, not a visit. He had already turned his back. Anne began to unravel. Her letters grew frantic. She asked for her daughter. She pleaded for justice. She fluctuated between despair and hope believing she would be released and fearing she would die. But through it all, she remained articulate, fierce, even witty. To one lady, she said with dark humor, "I have a little neck." On May 15th, Anne was brought to trial. It was a spectacle, held at the Tower in the King's Hall. The jury was composed of her enemies, courtiers who had envied her, nobles who had supported Catherine, rivals who had waited years for this moment. Anne stood tall. She wore a plain black gown and a hood that shadowed her face. She listened as the charges were treason, adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king. She denied them all, with eloquence, with dignity, with the calm of a woman who knew her fate had already been sealed. Despite her defense, Anne was found guilty. The verdict was never in doubt. She was sentenced to death. By fire or sword, the king would decide. Burning was the traditional punishment for women convicted of treason. But Henry, in what he called an act of mercy, commuted her sentence to beheading, not by the axe, but by sword. A French executioner was summoned, an expert, known for his speed and precision. This too was cruel irony. The same man who had written sonnets for her now arranged her execution with foreign efficiency. In the Tower, Anne waited. She was told she would die on May 18th. She prepared herself, took communion, confessed, prayed. But at the last moment, the execution was delayed by a day. The reason was never given. Anne was forced to face her death, not once, but twice. Through it all, she remained composed. Those who saw her in the Tower described her as graceful, devout, and at times almost detached. She gave gifts to her ladies. She wrote letters to her family. She asked God for mercy. And most powerfully, she forgave. She never confessed the charges, not once. "I am clear of all the accusations," she said. "I have never wronged the king," but she never publicly condemned him either. On May 19th, Anne rose early. She dressed carefully in a grey gown trimmed with fur. Underneath, a crimson bodice, practical, dignified, colours that would hide blood. At dawn, the crowd began to gather, about 1,000 souls. Not as many as expected, but they stood in silence, heads bowed, as Anne was led out to the scaffold. The executioner, dressed in black, waited quietly. Anne knelt. There was no block, no axe, only the sword, hidden from her view. She spoke calmly to the crowd. "I come here to die, according to the law. I do not accuse the king. I pray God save him and send him long to reign over you. A gentler prince was never born." Then she turned to her ladies, gave them one last smile, and said, "Remember me." The executioner called out, "Where is my sword?" To distract her, she turned her head, and in that instant, the blade fell. A single stroke. It was over. The queen was dead. But the fall of Anne Boleyn would echo through history. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day wear a crown heavier than her mother's and wear it longer, wear it longer. Her execution, meant to erase her, instead immortalized her. Anne had risen higher than any woman of her time, and in falling, she left a legacy that could not be buried, even when they buried her in an unmarked grave, even when her portraits were destroyed, even when her name was struck from every record in court. Anne Boleyn had become more than a queen. She had become a warning, a legend, and eventually a symbol of a woman who dared to reach for power in a world that feared female ambition. Her fall was not just the end of a queen, it was the beginning of an era. The days following Anne's death moved quickly. Henry did not mourn. He did not retreat into solitude or reflection. Instead, he celebrated. On the very day of Anne's execution, he dressed in white. The next day, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 10 days, they were married. It was as if Anne had never existed. Her personal belongings were removed from court. Her initials were carved out of stone. Her emblems destroyed. Her motto, "The Most Happy," was wiped from tapestries and walls. It was a coordinated erasure. But even the most thorough destruction leaves traces. In quiet corners of the kingdom, people whispered, some in fear, some in awe, some mourned. Others rejoiced, but none were untouched by her fall. The speed, the brutality, the finality shocked even those accustomed to Tudor politics. And then there was Elizabeth. The little girl, just 2.5 years old, was declared illegitimate. Her royal title was stripped. Her household was dissolved. She became simply the Lady Elizabeth. But those who knew her, those who knew her mother, saw something else. They saw intelligence, will, fire. Anne had left more than scandal. She had left a successor. In time, Elizabeth would become the most formidable ruler England had ever seen. Her reign would eclipse her father's, in peace, in power, and in permanence. And in every move she made, she carried a shadow, a reminder of the mother she lost to ambition and betrayal. Anne's fall began with a miscarriage, but it ended with a monument, not carved from stone, but from memory, from history, from the quiet defiance of a woman who died with dignity and changed the world in doing so. The fall of Anne Boleyn wasn't just the story of a queen undone. It was the triumph of a man who had mastered the machinery of power. Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was no noble. He had risen from a blacksmith's son to the king's chief minister, ruthlessly intelligent, endlessly pragmatic, and unbound by sentiment. He understood better than anyone that survival in the Tudor court depended not on loyalty, but on timing. And in 1536, the timing was perfect. Anne had once been his ally. She had championed reform, supported the break from Rome, shared his interest in diminishing the church's power and redistributing its wealth. Together, They had dismantled centuries of Catholic dominance, but allies in court are never permanent. Anne wanted a reformation of the soul. Cromwell wanted control of the land, the revenue, the institutions. She elevated radicals. He promoted bureaucrats. She demanded idealism. He prized obedience. Their interests clashed. Their vision of England diverged. And Cromwell, watching Henry grow weary of Anne, sensed an opportunity. To preserve his influence, he would remove the one person who stood in his way. Not gradually, not politely, but completely. Cromwell understood that accusations weren't enough. They had to be sensational, treasonous, personal. The court thrived on spectacle, and to kill a queen, you needed a story that could be swallowed by nobles and commoners alike. So he began to weave it. Behind the scenes, he planted questions. Why did Anne spend so much time with her brother George? Why did she show favor to low-born musicians? Was her flirtation with courtiers merely courtly, or something more? He fed doubts to the king, carefully, gently, and Henry, craving escape and already infatuated with Jane Seymour, listened. Cromwell's brilliance was in the speed of the execution, not of Anne's body, but of her reputation. Within weeks, he had arrested, interrogated, and extracted confessions from men who had no true connection to Anne's supposed crimes. A court musician, a loyal knight, a childhood friend, a brother. It wasn't a trial, it was an obliteration, and yet the court accepted it, because Cromwell had calculated everything. He knew the nobles who hated Anne's pride, the ambassadors who needed a political shift, the churchmen who resented her Protestant leanings. He pulled them together, not with promises, but with silence. No one resisted, and so the lie became law. Cromwell staged every moment, from Anne's arrest to her trial, from the choreography of charges to the timing of her execution. He choreographed a political masterpiece. And when the sword fell on May 19th, Cromwell didn't flinch. He had secured his power. For Henry, Cromwell delivered not just freedom from Anne but plausible deniability. The king could marry again without admitting error. Anne wasn't simply dismissed. She was guilty. She had betrayed him. Cromwell made the king a victim. But it wasn't just about the queen. Cromwell's true goal was transformation. With an gone, he accelerated the dissolution of the monasteries. He seized lands, rewrote laws, and redrew the map of English religion. He became not just the king's instrument, but the architect of modern England. His power, in the wake of Anne's death, reached its height. But Cromwell, like Anne, had made enemies. They watched, they waited, and they remembered. What Cromwell failed to see was this. In destroying Anne so spectacularly, he had set a precedent that even the highest could fall in silence, that justice could be scripted, that innocence didn't matter if the narrative was strong enough, and that someday that script might be used against him. For now, though he was triumphant, he had orchestrated one of the most infamous political takedowns in history. Not with swords, but with words. An England forever changed by Anne Boleyn's fall now belonged for a moment to Thomas Cromwell. In the shadow of the tower where Anne Boleyn's head fell, her legacy began to rise. She left behind a child, Elizabeth, just 2.5 years old, declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, cast out of court. She was too young to remember the mother who once held the kingdom in her hands, but the ghost of Anne Boleyn never left her. Elizabeth was raised in the margins, shuttled between country houses, taught by tutors, studied in silence, watched every gesture of power from a distance. She knew early that survival depended on caution and memory, because even when her mother's name was unspoken, her presence was everywhere. Elizabeth learned not to speak of Anne, not to ask questions, not to challenge the official version that her mother had betrayed the king and died justly. But deep within, Elizabeth never believed it. And as she grew, so did her quiet defiance. Anne Boleyn had died, reaching for power. Elizabeth would inherit that ambition and master it. She was not raised to be queen. After Henry married Jane Seymour, the succession shifted again. Edward, Jane's son, became the future. Elizabeth was background, political furniture, but she watched, she learned. Under Edward's reign, she survived religious purges by keeping her head down. Under Mary Tudor, her Catholic half-sister, she survived suspicion, arrest, and a threat of execution by wielding the same weapon Anne once had: silence and poise. When Mary died in 1558, England turned reluctantly, nervously to Elizabeth. She was 25, unmarried, childless, and the daughter of the most infamous queen in the country's history. But Elizabeth stepped forward, not with apologies, but with strategy. She did not run from her past. She used it, subtly, cleverly. She did not speak of an ab, but she surrounded herself with her mother's allies, wore her mother's symbols, and ruled with her mother's fire. She reclaimed the white falconon's heraldic emblem and had it stitched into her robes. She promoted men who had served her mother. She insisted on being crowned in a coronation that evoked Anzoni, bigger, grander, and unchallenged. And then she did something no one expected. She refused to marry. "I am married to England," she declared. She had learned what marriage had cost her mother, so she would not be defined by a husband. She would not risk sharing power. She would become what Anne never had the chance to be: a sovereign woman, alone and unassailable. Her reign became a golden age, not because it was peaceful. Elizabeth's England faced rebellions, plots, wars, and threats from every corner of Europe, but because she turned vulnerability into strength. Every attack on her legitimacy, every whisper about her birth, every insult hurled at her mother, Elizabeth absorbed them and turned them into armor. She weaponized imagery. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana Astrea. Her portraits were deliberate propaganda, majestic, untouched, eternal. She stood before maps of the world, her hand on the globe. She ruled not just as a monarch, but as a myth. Behind that image was the echo of an Anne who had worn crimson beneath her grey gown to hide the blood. Anne, who had spoken softly to the crowd before the sword struck. Anne, who had dared to believe that a woman could shape the fate of a kingdom. Elizabeth did more than shape it. She transformed it. Under her, England became a Protestant stronghold, a naval power, a cultural beacon. Shakespeare wrote in her courts. Drake sailed her seas. Explorers carried her name to distant continents. And yet, she never stopped being her mother's daughter. When questioned about her legitimacy, she did not flinch. When challenged on the memory of Anne Boleyn, she remained composed. She knew that to rule as a woman was to constantly defy gravity, and she balanced herself with the lessons of the past. She did not repeat her mother's mistakes. She never gave her heart freely, never relied on men, never let love dictate politics. Elizabeth learned that the crown was both gift and weapon, and she wielded it better than any king before her. Her court was filled with loyalists, but she trusted no one completely. She flirted, but never fell. She promised, but never surrendered. She ruled for 44 years, longer than any Tudor, longer than her father. And when she died in 1603, unmarried, childless, and undefeated, she left behind more than a throne. She left a legacy, the legacy of a woman who rose from scandal, who carried the name of a condemned queen and turned it into a crown. Anne Boleyn had been erased from records, painted out of portraits, buried in silence. Elizabeth brought her back without a word. She didn't need to vindicate her mother in speeches or edicts. She did it through power, through presence, through a reign that made Anne's execution not a failure, but the price of transformation. In every decision Elizabeth made, every bold stroke of policy, every calculated refusal to marry, every act of defiance, there was the ghost of a queen who walked to the scaffold with dignity. Anne's legacy was not her trial, it was not her death, it was her daughter. And through Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn triumphed. Anne Boleyn died in silence. No outcry, no rebellion, no monuments. Her name was stripped from court documents, her portraits destroyed, her emblems scratched from palace walls. England moved on. Jane Seymour wore the crown. A son was born. The narrative was settled. Anne had been a mistake, but history has a long memory, and myths grow best in silence. In the centuries after her death, Anne Boleyn began to rise again, not as a woman, but as an idea, and that idea changed with every generation. In the Tudor era, she was spoken of in hushed tones, a seductress, a traitor, a warning. Catholic propagandists portrayed her as a witch who had bewitched the king and led him to heresy. They painted her as deformed, with 6 fingers or a devil's mark. Her fall was used to justify the return of Catholic rule under Mary. Her name was poison. But under Elizabeth, Anne could not be publicly celebrated. She could not be erased. She became an unspoken symbol. In portraits of Elizabeth, hints of Anne appeared. The falcon, the fashion, the sharp gaze. Those who understood history saw the connection. But it wasn't until after Elizabeth's death that Anne's image began to shift. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as England changed, so did Anne. Writers began to reinterpret her story not as that of a homewrecker, but as a victim, a tragic heroine, the innocent woman destroyed by politics and a fickle king. She became a romantic figure, a woman wronged. This version persisted through the Victorian age. Victorian England, obsessed with morality and martyrdom, found in a fascinating contradiction. She was both sinner and saint, scandal and sacrifice. Her story fed novels, plays, paintings. Historians debated her guilt, her virtue, her final words. Gravesites were visited, flowers laid. By the 20th century, Anne Boleyn had become a cultural phenomenon. She was everywhere, in films, in historical fiction, in textbooks. Each retelling reshaped her. Sometimes she was the cunning courtier, other times the naive girl caught in a dangerous game. But more and more, she was portrayed as intelligent, strategic, brave. The feminist movement of the late 20th century reframed her again. Now, Anne wasn't just a woman who fell. She was a woman who dared to rise. Scholars began to explore her education, her reformist politics, her support for English translations of the Bible. They pointed out that Anne was the first English queen to be crowned with the crown of St. Edward, the crown of kings. That she didn't just marry Henry, she made herself indispensable. She became a symbol of female ambition, of intelligence in a world that feared it, of power that refused to apologize. In literature and film, Anne's image became more nuanced. She was no longer a one-dimensional figure. She was flawed, complex, powerful, a woman caught between love and politics, faith and survival. Modern retellings like Hilary Mantel's, Wolf Hall, and television series such as The Tudors brought her to life for new generations, not just as a figure of history, but as a mirror for modern questions. What does it mean to be powerful as a woman? What does ambition cost? Who writes our legacy when we're gone? Anne Boleyn became a rallying cry for those erased by history, a reminder that the official record is often written by the victors and that the truth is buried beneath layers of fear, myth, and control. But Anne's myth isn't just about tragedy, it's about triumph. Her story, once used to shame, became a story of survival beyond death, of influence that outlived the blade, of a woman who, though buried without a tombstone, refused to stay buried. Today, at the Tower of London, a glass plaque marks the site of her execution. Each year, on May 19th, roses are laid there, not out of duty, but out of reverence. Not because she was perfect, but because she was powerful, and because history tried to silence her, but failed. Anne Boleyn's myth continues to evolve. She is a cautionary tale, a feminist icon, a cultural riddle. She is studied by historians, idolized by students, debated by scholars, and dramatized by artists. And through it all, her memory refuses to fade. She represents something larger now, the cost of challenging power, the danger of being different, the brilliance of a woman who would not stay in the shadows. Anne Boleyn is no longer just a queen who died. She is a symbol of what it means to be remembered, not because you were allowed to be, but because you refused not to be. Anne Boleyn began her story not as a queen, but as a question. What if a woman didn't wait to be chosen, but demanded to be crowned? What if intelligence was more magnetic than beauty? What if ambition in a woman was not a flaw, but a force? These were the questions Anne posed, not only to Henry VIII, but to the very foundation of power in her world. And for that, she paid the highest price. Her life was short, her reign shorter, but her impact unmeasurable. Anne did not come from royal blood. She rose through intellect, charisma, and sheer audacity. She reshaped a kingdom's religion, changed the course of European politics, and mothered a queen who would define an age. And yet, she died accused, disgraced, and discarded. History would try to define her in simple terms: temptress, heretic, martyr, victim. But Anne was none of these things, and all of them. She was both villain and visionary, both dangerous and dignified, both doomed and defiant. Her contradictions are what make her unforgettable. Her humanity is what makes her matter. Because Anne's story is not just about the past. It is about every woman who has been punished for being too smart, too ambitious, too visible, too much. She was punished for outshining the men around her, for thinking strategically, for refusing to play the passive role expected of her, for demanding a crown instead of a compromise. But the truth is, Anne Boleyn never wanted power for its own sake. She wanted recognition, she wanted legacy, she wanted to matter, and centuries later she does. Her voice echoes not just through history books, but through courtrooms, classrooms, stages, and screens. She's invoked in conversations about injustice, inequality, and identity. She's studied not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of how quickly society can turn on a woman who dares to rise. a symbol of how fragile status can be when it isn't backed by safety, a symbol of how memory can outlast every weapon used to silence it. And Boleyn's final words, spoken moments before the blade fell, were not angry or accusatory. She did not curse her husband. She did not claim martyrdom. She said simply, "I die a good woman, and I commend my soul to God." She forgave, even when the world had not forgiven her. She surrendered her body, but not her dignity. And in that moment, she became more than just a queen. She became a mirror for every society that fears powerful women, for every system that builds them up just to tear them down. In the end, Anne's death did not end her story. It began it. She lives on in Elizabeth, in every woman who has risen against the odds, in every person who refuses to be erased. Anne Boleyn is not just a figure from the past. She is a lesson, a warning, a legacy, and maybe, most powerfully, she is a voice, still speaking, still daring, still remembered.